Welcome to the Agent Odyssey. My name is Matt Wyman, CEO and co-founder of Okareo. Okareo provides simulation. So if you have voice agents or chat agents or headless agents making decisions, you can test them and see all the ways in which they might behave and deal with risk before it hits you in production. Today, I'm very excited to have Pramod Singh, the executive in residence at Duke University and former chief analytics officer at Yodlee, as a guest. Welcome, Pramod.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely. Let me just talk a little more about like your background. You've spent 2 decades working on data and decision making. You were at HP and Walmart for all the early days of building AI systems. You built one of the first large scale financial data businesses. Now you're teaching entrepreneurship at Duke. You're building a new company, Inquisit, focused on research, and you're finding traction in clinical trials. So maybe we should start there. Maybe you can tell me more about Inquisit, and then we'll get into like this sort of wealth of background actually living in data and moving it into the world of AI.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Right, and Inquisit, a very interesting story, as you said. Spent most of my life building AI systems in the industry, and then came over to Duke about a couple of years ago. And there, with my co-founder, who also happens to be a professor at Duke, and he also has a similar background of running a big AI company in the weather forecasting space. One of the learnings we saw that, as we looked at our colleagues here at Duke and how the typical research process evolves, we felt that, the kind of things, innovation we were able to bring in the industry, where I was in financial industry, in the tech, and him, that lot of the AI efficiencies can be gained in the process of fundamental research. Everything from doing a right smart search of the papers, synthesizing them, understanding it, could be done, and AI could be brought it into the process, right? I sort of went back to my days, about 25 years ago, when I was getting my PhD, and the so-called the background research. I mean, I literally remember it took me about 11 months to do that. I mean, my advisor gave me the papers to go read up, going to the libraries to do that, and we thought, now, if I had Inquisit at that point of time, that could have been a weekend's worth of work, right? Of looking at the current stage. So that was a motivation for us to get into that. And over the time period, I think we built out, we can now source all 120 million plus published papers across the world. And along the way, as we started building up, and we started getting some traction in the clinical trial space, we were able to bring in which is an open source now, the clinicaltrial.gov data, which is all the clinical trials and their results in US, right? And we started building systems which can make the classical research process much better, right? Everything from search to synthesizing to helping write the abstracts of the paper, or even helping finding the grants and help with that, right? So it was a natural process of seeing what our colleagues were doing across, and ended up doing that. And along the way, we started finding traction into clinical research space, which the area I'm in Research Triangle Park, there are a lot of companies here. But so we started getting into a simpler space where a drug discovery takes about 10 to 12 years to go do that. Lot of those processes are something we believe AI can come and dramatically reduce that. And this one of the things that which is the early part of a drug discovery is building clinical protocols for that. That is the process where a lot of these experts will take anything from $30,000 to $150,000 to go help write for these CROs or for these biotech companies. And we were able to kind of go build systems that can help do that much more efficiently, much better. I mean, I would say, right? I mean, so our competitor is the expert human who's writing that versus us, where we are using AI to go do that, right? So very interesting journey in the last 13, 14 months of, building Inquisit and seeing traction in some of these spaces.
I always find that it's the indicator of mastery when a person has been able to create large change in different industries under different conditions, but figuring out how to fit in each. And I'm curious how you think about those early roots of data and analytics and just trying to bring it together to get understanding versus the type of knowledge, of course, that you're now seeing pulled out of research. I mean, it's still data underneath, but the structure of it and the type of information that can be pulled out is very different from one to the other, right? So how much portability do you think there's been in the learning, or how much of it has been like a sharp divide in the thinking necessary to actually consume or build those early data systems to the research orientation that you're seeing now?
Very good question, Matt, right? And I really believe this is a continuum, right? In some sense. If I go back to my old days at, starting at Walmart, more than 20, 25 years ago, where we were able to go build an assortment planning system for them. So idea of what item to put in which store and how much to put. In fact, believe it or not, at that point of time in 98, 99 period, we used clustering algorithms to go cluster stores based on their selling ratios, and then use decision trees to go predict what items should they carry. And even now that Walmart carries that, the name still is there, right? That we called it MCAP system. So that was a grounding in some sense of making sure that you have access to the right data. You have an intelligence to kind of go build that, but solve the real problems. I think one thing which has carried through, I would say, the journey across multiple industries and even now in academia and more agentic AI companies is, I say, I typically like to work backwards in terms of making sure that you have a good grasp on the actual problem you are solving and sort of work backwards from there. And the reason I think I'm a big believer of that is in our space, especially where I am, a lot of times my teams, you get, too much overwhelmed by the sophistication of the model you are using, right? Or the algorithms. I mean, across years, I have built teams of, 150, 200 people. And a lot of times people are looking for the most complex model to put it on their resume, or just the pride that they get, right? But I have always felt, and even today, although I teach AI for a living now, right? That use the simplest model that can solve your problem and work backwards.
Right.
Think of AI as a means to an end, not the end, right? And I'm still a big believer of that, right? And so again, to answer your question, I think if some of those learnings have kind of gone from Walmart to Hewlett Packard, where we ended up building some of the big solutions, solving some of the biggest marketing problems in US in the SMB space, to going to a competitively a young company, Yodlee, and building out the biggest alternative data business, where we took the data which was part of the financial system, enriched that, and created an alternative data business, which actually became bigger than the mothership itself, right? So, but I think that the basics around making sure that you have your problems well identified, and you work backwards to go solve the problem and build the systems that can scale and last. That I think are some of the learnings that I carry from one role to another one.
So, I mean, in some respects, I mean, coming from product, I would describe some of what you're talking about as first principles, like getting back to first principles. Like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? What's the pain point on the other side that you're actually building towards to resolve? Not just it's a thing and therefore I'm going to use it because it's cool. And I think we're seeing a lot of it right now, where agentics and agents are being applied to problems. But I go back to, you just described an amazing system that Walmart used to figure out where it should be, putting products for people to buy, and it's organizing this entire retail environment to optimize. And yet, medium-sized businesses today may not have access to systems like that, and today don't have that kind of control or awareness of inventory and supply chain and the retail environment. And yet, so wonderful that Walmart so big can go put that in place. So we all rush to this next thing, which is agents, but there's still a long tail of learnings that people had, like systems you've built that haven't made their way into the world yet. And so is it actually reasonable to believe that the average business makes this leap into some of these agentic systems, or do we need to find ways to almost backport the learnings, use agentic systems to backport these learnings so people can get access to it, and access to the type of advantages.
Matt, you're bringing up a very good point. I must admit I hadn't thought deeply about it, but there's such a significant point that you're bringing up. And now that you tell me, it's very true, because even now I meet so many companies, I advise a lot of companies. And you're correct, even 20, 22 years later, you don't see even mid-sized retailers using some of that intelligence, right? So there's definitely, maybe we are reaching an inflection point, and that's what the starting point of our conversation with agents coming in. There's an ability to maybe backport some of that intelligence back to the companies that were either left, behind, or other one. I would say that the barrier to the entry was so too high, right? I must
That's
say,
what I
even
think too.
yeah, even at the earlier point, I remember it's a long time back, but trying to go run those clustering algorithms, decision trees, you have to get a unique server, you're talking few $100,000, even at that point of time, right? Getting a proprietary copy of, a SaaS enterprise miner was, big sum of money, right? And that's just not possible. Now the age we have evolved in, with a lot of open source coming in, right? I'm looking at 2011 on, I have mandated all my teams to start to go use open source. In fact, my last job at Yodlee, we made sure that we do not go into proprietary data science softwares, right? Now with agents coming in, I think there's an opportunity and almost an obligation for people like me and you to try to make it more democratic, right? If you recall the barrier, the magic happened because of the configuration of three things, right? Data, uh, the access to the data, which is now getting much better, and the compute that you can compute has become a lot cheaper, and the algorithms, right? So algorithms and the compute, that has dramatically gone in favor of doing the democratization, right? Now, literally in our, I have been where we've been spending tens of millions of dollars on the hardware in big companies, to spending millions of dollars for my last role to go compute on a cloud, to now in my startup, I think the dollars are something, I can just swipe my personal credit card and do the compute. So that magnitude has shifted, and the barrier to entry has dramatically come down, right? So that does open up a space where that intelligence, if I may call that, right?
Sure.
With that algorithms and everything, and agentic AI coming in, that we can make it a lot more democratic.
Well, I also think that the access in terms of knowledge is interestingly changing. So, for example, all those systems and all those capabilities were the domain of data scientists and PhDs and people who understood the algorithms and really had a very fundamental understanding of the data itself. And the business teams didn't yet necessarily know even what to ask for. And so there was a relationship between research and researchers who had depth and real strong foundations, having conversations with business to establish what was possible and then to go manifest it into the world. But we're only just now starting to bridge some of that and trying to make it accessible to, developers and subject matter experts and other people. And that's part of what this whole world, ChatGPT has really opened a lot of people's eyes to what's possible, but there's still a lot more knowledge to be gained. Not everyone will know even the state of the art that already exists, and they just assume some of what they see is new when actually it's been around for 20 years and they're just finally getting access to it. And this is something you're right in the middle of. Like you're trying to help teach people, and you're trying to help figure out how do you expose this sort of next generation of builders to these concepts. So how do you sort between sort of the foundational concepts that you think everyone should have around data and the possibilities with data, and the sort of, sorry to phrase it like this, but the magical, language model capabilities, which are really discrete. They're different. Like you don't use the same models for the same activities. So how do you help people imagine that next world using both these sets of information?
Amazing question, right? And kind of fits my background well, because I have sort of, that I have an academic degree, but spent most of my time in the industry, right? So a lot of things that I do even here in my current role is to lead the classes that train students exactly for that, right? So for example, I'm teaching right now a class on AI product management. And the whole idea is, how do you as a product manager develop products, which have, AI as a core component of it, right? And we walk students through an actual project through the length of the semester, right? In terms of, figuring out, getting the idea, making sure the idea is well vetted, come in and showing the interaction with, how are you interacting with your data scientists, your engineers, your analysts, because some of those dynamics in the companies are because those politics happens, that the clashes happen, the friction happen, and how do you go present your part of it, right? So we bring in a lot of capstone real projects for the students to go work with. So in some sense, what we try to do is to get students ready by the time they graduate, that they have seen a real experience. They have seen through the life cycle of, how do you go source data. But what happens is, when I started hiring people, from top universities across the world, a data scientist will come with a lot of ego, will expect the data to be served on a platter, right? And felt that their job was only to go build that model, right? In real world, me and that's probably not even 5 to 10% of your actual
Yeah.
time spent, right? And that's an experience, a very humbling experience. But a lot of people who do not go through that or understand and respect that process do not succeed very well, right? So making sure, showing that, making sure there's nothing wrong in going and labeling your own data. You might be a senior data scientist, because that's what's going to get your product much better, right? um, and another thing is happening is, as the product management is evolving, making sure that you're not a theoretical product management. You have some understanding of how data scientists is working and thinking, how engineers are working and thinking, because at those days of being so-called, non-technical product manager does not work very well right now. With agents coming in, the barrier to entry is low. The opportunities to go learn things are there, and it's important that everybody has a bit of other. So I used to give talks around, ideal AI organization or analytics organization, and always said it's almost a three-legged stool of, being an engineer, being a data scientist, being an analyst. And I said, it's unfair to expect that you will be very deep in all three, but you may have a base somewhere, but you need to have some understanding of other two, and call it three-legged stool, right? And organizations which in some sense help balance themselves in a healthy way do much better than the ones which, which just focus on one thing and try to outsource other piece of work, right?
Yeah, it resonates so strongly with me. There are so many types of product managers. I mean, it's funny that we have that title, because it doesn't, you really can't just blanketly compare it from one place to another, because product managers also have to be subject matter experts. Otherwise, they can't represent the customer, and they have to have that empathy for the customer, because they need to do outside in thinking. Otherwise, if you're just doing inside out thinking, if you're too rooted in the interior, the engineering, the data, and et cetera, you don't actually solve the problem the customer
Correct.
has, the
Yeah.
problem the business has. So it's a really tough tension that sits between the two. And I'm curious if you're finding that there are aspects of building products using AI, and I don't mean using AI as a co-pilot to build a product. I mean building products that are part and parcel agent or AI based. Do you think that requires a different kind of product thinking, more than just understanding the data? I 1000% agree on the understanding the data, because that gives you a sense of what's possible. It gives you a sense of what the universe looks like. But do you find that the actual form of the product also needs to shift, and that person needs to represent it differently?
Again a great question, right? I absolutely do, right? And these are some fine tunings that you may have to do. As we discuss, some of the first principles remain the same, right? But one of the very big difference that I talk about is, when you are you could be a very good product manager, you're developing real products. Even in software you're developing, right? Almost everything is deterministic in nature, right? You route a bit of software, something happens. As these products, the AI products coming in, by definition, everything is almost probabilistic in nature. And that I think is the fundamental point of difference. And obviously it manifests into multiple other things we can talk about, right? So in other words, right, I mean, you might be working for a software company. You're tasked to go build out a CRM system. You write something and you say, if I input this is an expected output, and that will happen unless something changes, right? Now, when you are building these systems which have AI and you have models which are spitting an output, number one, almost no model will be 100% accurate all the time, right? So there are always the things where there'll be false values. You could even have a model with 99% accuracy, but if you are putting 100 million rows through that a day, then you have 1 million wrong observations. I mean, and question is, how do you deal with that? So that's where a maturity of a product organization comes in, right? It's not like that you may potentially be making an error. What systems you build around it to go handle that, right? I mean, just go back to very basics, your search on Google. How many times when you search, the very first thing is exactly what you wanted? Maybe,
Well, it's usually
I
an
don't
ad.
know. Yeah, I'm not a 70, 80. So, I mean, whatever number you pick, you say 80%. So the 20% times they're wrong, right? It's maybe second or third or fourth are not there, right? They have built a system where they rank it, and you don't get mad. You just go down the list, you see that, and do that. So, in some sense, it's a very simple way of saying how did they build their UI around that output of managing that part of it, right? So that's why I mean, that's why what I try to teach in my classes is, if you are a product manager for an AI product, there are multiple things I'll talk about. How to manage errors, but knowing the fundamental difference is living in a probabilistic world, and what kind of systems we build to get that probability as good as possible, to build systems that when you are not right, how do you gracefully handle, when to exit, when you may have to even push the output to a human. So very important, right? I mean, we go work so much with our precision and recall, but they're also a function of the problem you are solving. A model which is recommending you the next likely purchase, I mean, I might be okay with 90% precision, versus recommending which drug to give or which surgery to perform. That's a very different ball game, right? I mean, one where somebody not getting the best recommendation versus somebody maybe potentially impacting the health or the life, right? So I don't want to give generic. I get this question asked a lot. So what is a good model? What percentage, right? It's a function of the problem you're solving and the space you are
Yep.
in and what your tolerance level is, right?
I agree. And it's funny. There was a time where you could be buying, a box of nails, but you would still get recommended Harry Potter because everyone loved Harry Potter, right?
Yeah.
And that was fine. You're in a retail environment, but as you apply that to the more real world, you see a shift. And I think many designers, product designers, probably shouldn't pick on product managers, designers, the whole universe building the user experience around AI is really leaning heavily on human in the loop. And yet I think a lot of the human in the loop applications or usages of it are really just ways of avoiding testing and of ways of avoiding actually trying to understand the problem in detail enough to think about, okay, wait, should I burden a person with having to make a decision at this moment in time? Or is it good enough to provide the set of choices and not force the human in the loop? There are appropriate places for the human to appear in the loop, to make a choice, to pick the right item and to continue. But there are also sort of it's being used as an escape hatch. And I think that the understanding probability and thinking about the user experience of the product itself in terms of probability is a missing skill that we're just figuring out right now. And people have to start thinking differently about the products they're building and the user, the outside in user experience of the products to figure out what's the right way to formulate. But I also think there's a certain amount of training that needs to happen amongst all of us in how to use these. When the iPhone first showed up, none of us knew, and we weren't accustomed to holding an iPhone, and figuring out directions or paying for something with it. We had to learn. Those were essentially, for lack of a better term, those were skills that we had to learn. And so in the product world and in the data science world, where we're trying to harness data in these new ways, there are these new skills that need to come together. And since you're sitting across both, I'm very curious if you think that there's in fact is there a new role that sits and bridges? And it doesn't be called product management, doesn't have to be called data, but is there a new role that is deeply immersed in understanding the data set and what can be done with it from a business perspective, but isn't really the person who's just building? It's not just the data analyst who's building, you know, mind you, there's very hard to build some of those reports and do some of that reporting, but that's its own sort of visualization role. Is there a new role that you're starting to see show up as you're talking about these, or is it the same roles just divided with more skills?
Again, very good question, and you're making me think a lot, But I think it's a very good point you're making, right? So one observation, I'll go back to my last role and try to answer your question is, as the organization evolved, and my typical structure of the last big organization I led was, I was the chief analytics officer, so I had data engineers reporting to me, data scientists. I created a team of what we call business analysts. These were the people who worked very closely with the product and the sales team, bringing the outside ideas in. And then obviously, then I had created a team of, humans in the loop, who were the experts at tagging data, running reports.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sister teams were around, around DevOps, right? People running those systems and all. So and I think you're hitting on a very important point. Over the years, as we evolved, and as your team started to get better and more immersed into the actual business processes, actual products, I started to see a lot of these newer product ideas was started to come from the people who were part of this ecosystem, not part
Yeah,
of the product team. And that was, to me, was very healthy,
it's a really
right? I
good
mean, in
point.
fact, in the beginning, it looked like almost a friction, right? Because these people can see and look what's happening because they had curiosity, but also they were deep in the data, right? So if you start to bring in, and I get asked this advised a lot, right? If you have a deeper understanding of data, what the relationship is, and you have also a good understanding of where the market is going, where you are, how are your product positioned, how are your competitors positioned, you can start to think deeper and bring in ideas which are much better than person only unidimensionally looking, right? As you correctly said, a product manager has to look both outside and inwards. What we have done a bad surveys, and I think most of people in tech are to be blamed for it. You see a really good manager, engineer, and you have to promote the person. Okay, let's make the person product manager. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of times that's disaster, right? Because all you're doing is because you're comfortable looking in, you keep looking in, right? So you might be very smart in solving a problem, but most times not the right problem, right? So it's very
Well, they're
important.
very good at orchestrating typically, right? They know how to orchestrate the system. So that part's there. But
Yes.
you're right, that bridge is hard.
Yeah. And I think the role which I see evolving in some sense, and I it goes back to my last answer also, is be multidimensional, right? I mean, it's probably different than what I would have told 20 years ago in my career, right? That have ability to go do multiple things. Make sure in whatever places you are in, even if you're in business school or even in my organization here, right? I keep coaching students to make sure that if you do not understand the problem you are solving or how what you are working will actually impact the final solution, stop working on it, right? You need to be able to draw the dots between your work and if you cannot, I mean, in fact, in my last role, I had told the team that if your manager cannot explain it to me, go to their manager. They cannot explain, come to me. If I cannot explain, go to the CEO, right? But you need to have that basis, right? And only then you can connect the dots and actually add value, right?
I love that.
Yeah.
So I always ask folks about the human skills. So now I'm curious, so how you're going to answer. So as you think about AI and you think about all these new capabilities and models and products that are showing up, what's the human skill you think people need to really focus on to be ready for that world? Is it this multidimensional thinking, or do you think there's another skill that we also need to incorporate?
I think I'm a big believer in on a work side. Yes, a multidimensional thinking, I think, is a way that you will be very successful, right? But a lot of very basic things that I think will become. I mean, you go back to the computer science department. You talk about being very good developer and things like that, and those are good and probably will stay valid, right? But having the curiosity, right? Making sure that you are understanding the full picture, right? Having an ability to go ask those classes of questions it may sound pretty cliche, right? But I think it's one of the most important skills to go do that, right? Even if you are as a young student, master student going and interviewing for a job at a big tech company, have an ability to go ask the question of, what the big picture is, right? And how the big goal or big picture converts to the actual role that you are going to do, right? There are, we both know that with all LLMs coming in, some of the task of being the code, the coding part of it is becoming a lot easier. We have been talking about how it's putting a lot of constraint on the lower level jobs, right? Because in organizations where you need 20 junior engineers, may only need 5 now, right? Because these things, efficiencies are getting in. So what does that mean, right? That you need to kind of start to think through what more kind of things can you bring in, right? I had somebody who come and talk to my class, and they said, well, the person was telling that when you go to job interview, say, hey, I'm John, and John comes in for the job and brings 3 agents also with him. And this is what we can do, right? So the idea was that you go project yourself, that coming in, I can do all these things, right? And
Yep.
so I think that kind of a curiosity, that kind of a way to go explain yourself will go take young people a long way.
Love it. The need to continue to be curious about the world around us doesn't stop just because there are models that can help us with some of the tasks in it. And we have to figure out the ways in which we can continue to push. Fantastic conversation today. Thank you so much, Pramod.
Thank you, Matt, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you again for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely.